There's a moment in American motorsport history that almost feels like a myth. A single man, in a small garage behind his house somewhere in the Midwest, welded together a machine so big, so loud, and so ridiculous that even his friends told him he was out of his mind. Nobody believed it would ever run. Nobody believed it could ever steer. And absolutely nobody believed it could change motorsport forever. But then, it moved. It didn't just move. It thundered. It shook the earth. It made grown men stop mid-sentence, jaws hanging open. And when that giant mass of steel crawled over a row of junkyard cars like they were soda cans, the entire crowd understood instantly. They were witnessing the birth of something the world had never seen before. A monster. A monster truck. Most people today think monster trucks were always franchises, merchandise, packaged entertainment for stadiums. But before the TV broadcasts, before sold-out arenas, before kids begged their parents for toy replicas, there was just one man, building something nobody asked for and nobody understood. A man who ignored everyone who told him it was pointless. A man who didn't follow trends, he created one. And the craziest part? He wasn't even trying to start a sport. He just wanted to build the biggest, toughest truck the world had ever seen. His name was... Fans would later call him the Pioneer, the Mad Fabricator, the father of the monster truck. But back then he was just a quiet gearhead with big hands, a calm voice, and a dream so oversized it barely fit in his own garage. Picture this. Early, 1,970 seconds. Gas is cheap. Detroit iron rules the road. Every driveway smells like hot oil, and every neighborhood has at least one guy who spends more time under his truck than inside his house. But this guy? He was different. While everyone else was bolting on chrome bumpers or raising their 4x4 2 inches, he was welding plate steel thicker than your wrist. He wasn't building a truck, he was building a statement. Neighbors would stop and stare at the growing hulk in his yard. The frame stretched taller. The axles grew heavier. The tires didn't even come from the automotive world. They came from tractors, farm equipment, machines meant to crush soil, not race. Every time he rolled one of those tires upright, it was like lifting a small boulder. Why? People asked him. Because I can, he'd answer. But the truth was deeper. Ever since he was a kid, he believed bigger machines meant bigger possibilities. He grew up in an era when America loved giants. Giant V8s, giant chrome bumpers, giant ambitions. From Evel Knievel's jumps to Smokey Yunick's engineering stunts, America celebrated people who pushed limits. And this man wanted to push them further than anyone had dared. He didn't know it then, but he was laying the groundwork for a billion-dollar motorsport. He was about to create a machine that would become an American icon, something fathers would take their sons to see, something families would remember for decades, something that made people feel like kids again. All he knew was this: if he could get this monster running, even just once, the world would never forget it. The funny thing about legends is that they almost never start as legends. They start in silence, in backyards, in dimly lit garages with a single buzzing fluorescent bulb and a radio softly playing classic rock from a dusty speaker in the corner. And that's exactly where this story truly begins. Late nights, cold coffee, and a man working alone long after everyone else had gone to sleep. Most men in those days built hot rods or muscle cars. Maybe they lifted their 4x4 trucks a couple inches for weekend mudding. But this man? He was in his garage welding reinforced steel into shapes nobody could identify. Every few minutes, sparks lit up the yard like fireflies. People driving home from work would slow their cars just to see what he was doing. It looked less like a truck project and more like the birth of some kind of mechanical dinosaur. He kept to himself, but not in an unfriendly way. He just had this quiet focus about him, the kind of focus older Americans still talk about when they say they don't make men like that anymore. When he worked, he didn't talk, he didn't take breaks, he didn't daydream, he built. Every weld was intentional, every plate of steel had a purpose. And every time he stood back, wiping sweat and soot from his face, you could see it in his eyes, the vision was getting clearer. And then came the tires. If the truck was the skeleton, these tires were the soul. He had found them used on an old agricultural lot, colossal 48-inch tractor tires that looked absurdly oversized even when leaning against a barn. Most men wouldn't even try loading them into a truck. He somehow managed it on his own, inch by inch, using boards, winches, ropes, and sheer determination. When he finally rolled the first one into his driveway, it hit the ground with a thud that echoed through the entire neighborhood. That's when people started asking questions. What in God's name are you trying to build? Son, you planning to take that thing through a war zone? You're gonna flip that thing the first time you try moving it. He ignored all of it. Not out of arrogance, he just didn't want to defend something nobody else could see yet. The first time he mounted one of those massive tires onto the axle, it was like watching a sculpture suddenly come to life. The monster was beginning to take shape, towering over the garage roofline, overshadowing the trees. Kids riding their bikes would stop at the curb, stunned. Farmers who'd seen machinery of every kind couldn't help but chuckle and shake their heads. But the man wasn't laughing. He was thinking about weight distribution, about torque, about gearing, about how to make something this massive actually move under its own power without tearing itself apart. He knew that if even one weld was weak, the machine could twist itself in half. One mechanical failure, and it could roll, crush, or break everything around it. Every night, as he worked under the glow of that flickering garage light, he whispered the same thing under his breath. Just move once. And little did he know, when it finally did, the entire world of motorsport would never be the same again. The day the monster finally moved is the kind of moment older men still talk about today, standing in their garages, wiping grease off their hands, saying, "I remember exactly where I was when I first saw it happen." But before that legendary day arrived, there were weeks, months of trial, error, frustration, and problem solving that would have broken most men long before the finish line. Because here's what people don't understand. Building something this big isn't just mechanical, it's psychological. Every time he added weight, the steering behaved differently. Every time he adjusted the gearing, the torque fought back in unexpected ways. Every time he welded a new piece of reinforcement, some other part of the frame complained. It was like wrestling with a steel beast that refused to be tamed. This wasn't a project anymore. It was a battle. He'd fire the engine, an old, angry V8 pulled from a retired work truck. It would cough, sputter, shake the rafters, and then die. He'd tweak timing, reroute fuel lines, replace distributors, rewire entire harnesses, but every night ended the same way: silence. Just him sitting on a stool, staring at the immovable giant in front of him, wondering if he'd gone too far this time. But he kept going. Not for fame, not for money. Men like him built things because it's what they were. And just when it seemed like the frustration would break him, something unexpected happened. A neighbor, an older guy who had spent decades working in heavy machinery, stopped by. He'd been watching from afar, like half the county had, and finally decided to chime in. "You're overthinking it," the old man said. "You got all the strength in the world in those axles, but you're choking it with that gearing." No judgment, no criticism, just experience talking. The two men spent the next hour leaning over the engine bay, the kind of simple, quiet collaboration that built America far more than any boardroom ever did. They talked ratios, torque curves, tractors, trucks, farm equipment, They solved problems with calloused hands and real knowledge, not calculators and engineering programs. And the next morning, everything changed. He turned the key. The V8 rumbled, coughed, then roared. The giant shook. The windows of the house rattled. Dogs barked 3 streets away. And for the first time, the machine felt alive. He eased it into gear, heart pounding harder than the pistons firing beneath him. Slowly, almost unwillingly, the monster inched forward, then another inch, then another. And then, it moved. Not gracefully, not smoothly, but it moved under its own power. Neighbors came pouring out of their houses like it was the 4th of July. Kids screamed, grown men yelled. A few people clapped. The old man whistled under his breath. "Damn, son," he said. "You actually did it." The driver didn't smile, not yet, because he knew something nobody else did. Getting it to move was the easy part. What he wanted, what he dreamed of, was getting it to crush. And the first time he aimed that monster at a row of junk cars, the world of motorsport was about to change forever. A few days after that first crawl, the news started spreading around town quietly at first, like a rumor nobody believed. "He's gonna try crushing cars," someone said at the local diner. "Real cars," another whispered. "Rusty ones, from the junkyard." Half the men rolled their eyes. The other half leaned in a little closer. Because even if they wouldn't admit it, every guy who grew up around engines had dreamed at least once of rolling a giant machine over a car just to see what would happen. So on a cloudy Saturday morning, the kind where the air smelled like rain and gasoline, he fired up the monster and slowly drove it to a nearby lot behind an old farm equipment barn. It wasn't an official event. There were no posters, no tickets, no announcer with a microphone. Just a small crowd of neighbors, curious mechanics, and farmers leaning on pickup trucks with coffee mugs in their hands, watching the giant lumber down the gravel road. And waiting for it, 3 rusted-out cars lined up in a row. Dead machines, empty shells of their former lives. Chevys, Fords, doesn't matter, they all had the same destiny that day. He stopped the truck about 10 feet away from the first one. The engine rattled like an angry storm. The crowd fell dead silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. He took a breath, tightened his grip on the giant steering wheel, and eased his foot onto the throttle. The truck lurched forward. The first tire touched the hood of the old Chevy, and instead of stopping or bouncing off, the truck just kept climbing. The hood crumpled like aluminum foil. The windshield exploded into a spiderweb of cracks. And when the second tire made contact, the entire car flattened under the weight with a deep, metallic groan that echoed through the trees. People gasped. One man let out a laugh he couldn't hold back. Kids screamed with excitement. Dogs barked. It was chaos, but the good kind, the kind you feel in your chest. Then he did something that nobody expected. He didn't stop at one car. He kept going. The monster rolled down onto the roof of the second car, crushing it even faster than the first. The steel folded beneath the weight. All the while, the giant tires didn't slow. They didn't slip. They didn't protest. It was as if the machine had been born to do this. By the time he reached the third car, the crowd wasn't silent anymore. They were cheering, shouting, clapping. The kind of raw, unfiltered American excitement that doesn't happen in stadiums with rules and safety nets. It happens in backyards, dirt fields, and forgotten lots where men build things because nobody told them they couldn't. When he finally brought the machine to a stop, he sat there for a moment, hands trembling, not with fear, with victory. He'd done it. He'd created something the world had never seen before, something nobody believed in, something that didn't just move, but crushed. He didn't know it yet, but what happened that morning would travel across the Midwest like wildfire. Word of mouth, barber shops, hardware stores, tractor supply counters, men saying, "You gotta see this thing. You won't believe it." And soon, neither would the rest of America. News travels fast in small towns, but in the 1,970 seconds Midwest, when something unbelievable happened, it didn't just travel fast, it grew legs, hopped in a pickup truck, and spread across counties like a prairie fire. Within a week of that first crushing, people from miles away were driving past his house, just hoping to catch a glimpse of the giant machine sitting in the yard. Some slowed down, some stopped completely. Some even knocked on his door politely, hats in hand, asking, "Sir, mind if I take a picture of that thing?" He never said no. He wasn't looking for attention, but he wasn't hiding either. The monster truck sat there like a mechanical landmark, towering, impossible, undeniably real. A symbol of what one determined man could build with time, scrap metal, stubbornness, and a dream nobody else could see. But as the crowds grew, something unexpected started happening. Promoters began calling. At first, it was small local events, county fairs, tractor pulls, weekend shows that pulled in a few hundred spectators. The organizers didn't really know what to do with him. They'd say things like, "Could you, maybe, just bring that big thing out and drive over something?" Folks would pay to see that. He wasn't a performer, not by nature. But seeing the look on people's faces, the wide eyes, the dropped jaws, the pure childlike wonder, something inside him softened. Maybe this was meant to be shared, so he agreed. The first official show happened at a dusty county fairground with wooden bleachers, a PA system that crackled like a campfire, and a crowd made up of farmers, mechanics, truckers, and families looking for a Saturday thrill. The infield was muddy, uneven, and littered with old metal barriers. Under normal circumstances, no promoter would have let a machine that size run on that kind of ground. But these weren't normal circumstances. When he fired up the truck, the crowd felt it before they heard it. The ground vibrated under their feet. The bleachers shook. People covered their ears, but nobody looked away. Men who thought they'd seen everything suddenly felt like little kids again. Women held onto their children, pointing with amazement. Then, in front of hundreds of people, he lined up the monster with a row of junk cars and eased forward. The massive machine climbed the first car like it was nothing. The second one folded instantly. The third one disappeared under those tractor tires like it wasn't even there. The crowd went wild. But here's what really set the tone for the future of monster trucks. It wasn't the crushing. It wasn't the size. It wasn't the shock value. It was him. When the run was over, he didn't bask in applause. He didn't act like a superstar. He didn't brag or raise his arms in victory. He put the monster in park, shut it down, climbed out slowly, and smiled like an old mechanic proud of a job well done. Then he did what nobody expected. He walked straight to the kids in the front row. "Want to sit in it?" he asked one small boy, whose jaw was practically on the ground. The boy nodded so fast his hat fell off. And that moment, more than the crushing, more than the spectacle, was what made him unforgettable. Because he wasn't here to be a showman. He wasn't chasing fame. He was sharing a dream built with his own hands. That quiet humility, that blue-collar kindness, that's what turned a machine into a legend, and a builder into a pioneer. As the months rolled on, something remarkable began to happen. What started as a one-man backyard project slowly transformed into a full-blown phenomenon. County fairs turned into regional events. Regional events turned into multi-state invitations. Promoters who had never once called outside their local circuits were suddenly leaving messages on his answering machine, saying, "Sir, we hear you've got the biggest truck in America. Would you bring it to our show?" He didn't have a team. He didn't have a manager. He didn't have a plan. Just a truck, a toolbox, and a growing list of places that wanted to see him drive this impossible machine over piles of metal like he was walking across gravel. At first, he hauled the monster on a flatbed he'd modified himself, reinforced steel beams, oversized tie-downs, and a custom ramp he welded during a thunderstorm one night when a show deadline was looming. He'd load the truck up, hop into his pickup, and drive for hours on two-lane highways, with the radio humming in the background, headlights bouncing off fields and barns. These were lonely roads. Quiet ones. The kinds of roads where you think deeply about who you are and what you're doing. And although he would never admit it out loud, he knew something big was happening. Something historic. Something America had never seen before. When he arrived at the bigger shows, the atmosphere felt different. Workers would stop what they were doing just to watch him unload the giant machine. Younger mechanics would circle around like they were looking at a UFO that somehow landed in their parking lot. Truckers who had seen almost everything would whistle and shake their heads, saying things like, "Boy, that ain't a truck, that's a building." With every new event came new expectations. Promoters wanted bigger crushes, louder shows, more spectacle. Some wanted him to jump cars. Others wanted fire effects or timed runs. They didn't understand that this wasn't stunt equipment. It was a handmade machine, unpredictable and temperamental, held together by craftsmanship, sweat, instinct, and more than a little luck. But he never complained. Instead, he got there early, walked the course, knelt down to feel the dirt between his fingers, studied the junk cars, checked angles, measured distances in his head. He treated every show like a mission. Safety first, spectacle second. That was his quiet rule. And people respected him for it. Crowds grew bigger. Families arrived hours early just to claim good seats. Kids held cardboard signs with scribbled drawings of monster trucks crushing endless rows of cars. Older men leaned against the railings with the same excitement they used to feel at drag strips in the 60 seconds. And whenever he fired up the engine, something happened that's hard to describe unless you felt it. Thousands of people, adults, children, teenagers, went silent. Not because they were scared, but because they knew they were about to witness something unforgettable. Then he'd roll forward, slow and steady, the monster towering over everything in sight. The ground would shake, exhaust pipes would spit fire, and the moment he touched the first car, the crowd erupted with a roar that matched the machine itself. He didn't set out to be famous. He didn't set out to build a sport. He just wanted to build something extraordinary. But extraordinary things rarely stay small, and his creation was about to outgrow him, faster than he ever imagined. By the late 70 seconds, it wasn't just car shows and county fairs calling anymore. It was national promoters, television producers, motorsport organizers who normally spent their time chasing down drag racers and tractor pull champions. America had gotten a taste of something new, something loud, wild, and impossible, and they wanted more, a lot more. One night, after a long show in Missouri, he returned to his motel room, one of those old brick motor lodges with thin walls and humming refrigerators, to find a stack of messages waiting for him at the front desk. Not one, not two, but 15 invitations from different states. Kentucky, Texas, Indiana, even Florida was calling. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the papers in his hands. For the first time, he realized this wasn't just a regional novelty anymore. This thing he'd built, this monster on wheels, was spreading across the map like wildfire. But big attention brought big problems. Some promoters wanted him to perform dangerous stunts with almost no preparation time. Others offered big money, but only if he agreed to crush more cars, jump higher ramps, or add a little extra excitement with things like fireworks or timed races. It wasn't just shows anymore. It was pressure, expectations, tight schedules, bigger crowds. And his truck, his homemade creation, started to feel the strain. The frame cracked once during a show in Nebraska, and he had to weld it in the dark behind the arena while a local band played cover songs on stage. Another time, an axle snapped as he unloaded in Minnesota, and he spent 19 hours fixing it with borrowed parts because thousands of fans had already bought tickets. He wasn't a corporation. He wasn't a team. He was one man with a machine that weighed more than a small tractor. But he kept pushing because people believed in him. Families who couldn't afford vacations saved up to see him. Kids wrote him letters saying they wanted to build monster machines of their own someday. Old guys who'd spent decades turning wrenches walked up to him after shows with tears in their eyes, saying, "Son, I ain't never seen anything like that." Still, behind all the cheers and applause, something else was starting to happen. Competition. Other builders began watching from the sidelines, studying every inch of his truck. They took photos, they sketched diagrams, they analyzed his suspension, his steering geometry, his tire setup, and slowly, almost quietly at first, new monster trucks started appearing across the Midwest. Some were rough copies, others were bold experiments, but they all had one thing in common. They were inspired by him. But inspiration can turn into rivalry real fast. Promoters began asking him questions like, "Can your truck jump like theirs? Can you crush more cars? Can you do it faster, louder, bigger?" And while he stayed humble, stayed focused, stayed committed to the craft, he could feel the sport slipping out of his hands. The world he unknowingly created was evolving, growing teeth, becoming competitive. He'd lit the spark, but now the fire was spreading, and he had to decide whether he'd keep trying to lead it, or risk being left behind by the very thing he brought to life. By the early 80 seconds, the entire landscape had changed. What began as one man rolling over junkyard cars had turned into something bigger than anyone could have predicted, including him. He noticed it the moment he pulled into a major arena for the first time. Instead of the usual dirt fields and fairgrounds, he was staring at a fully lit stadium with concrete tunnels, concession stands, organized pit crews, and trucks lined up on display like they were part of a traveling circus. Except this wasn't a circus. This was something brand new, something he unknowingly helped create. The other trucks didn't look homemade anymore. They looked engineered, designed with blueprints, measured in drafting rooms, welded by teams instead of one guy with a torch and too much coffee. Trucks with polished paint, chrome headers, and custom parts he couldn't even buy in a store because they didn't exist when he started. He walked past one competitor's truck and overheard a promoter say, "This one's got nitrogen shocks, 4-link suspension, reinforced axles, state of the art." Words he'd never heard at his early shows. State of the art? Back then, his truck was the state of the art. Now it felt like the sport had sprinted ahead while he was still tightening bolts in motel parking lots under flickering streetlights. But the crowd didn't forget him, not even close. When he stepped into the arena for the pre-show parade, the roar that hit him was different from anything he'd heard before. Not polite applause, not simple excitement, something deeper, something like gratitude. The announcer's voice boomed across the loudspeakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, the original monster truck." People stood, people cheered. Some even held up old, faded Polaroids of his earliest crush shows, like they were holding pieces of American motorsport history. And in a way, they were. But fame doesn't fix physics. His truck was heavier, slower, and less forgiving than the sleeker, modern beasts he was suddenly competing against. Their suspensions were designed for jumping. Their tires had been re-engineered for stability. Their engines were tuned by specialists, not by one man pulling late-night wrench shifts fueled by diner coffee and cold sandwiches. He wasn't intimidated, but he was realistic. He didn't pretend he could match them jump for jump. That wasn't who he was. So he focused on what he could do better than anyone else. He put on a show. That night, while the newer trucks bounced across ramps and leapt skyward like mechanical acrobats, he stuck to his roots. Slow, controlled climbs, towering crushes, rolling over cars so cleanly you could hear the steel squeezing like tinfoil. The crowd loved it because he wasn't just driving a truck, he was showing them the birth of the sport. The younger drivers respected him too. even if they were outpacing him. Some called him sir. Some asked for autographs. Others quietly admitted that without him, they wouldn't even be here. But respect doesn't stop evolution. And underneath all the applause, he felt something he'd never felt before. For the first time, his creation was running away from him, turning into a spectacle he'd never fully planned for. And he had to decide: keep up with the new world or embrace the legacy he'd already built. As the years rolled on, the sport didn't just grow, it exploded. Stadium shows replaced fairgrounds. Corporate sponsors replaced handshake deals. Television crews replaced local newspaper photographers with disposable flash cameras. Suddenly, monster trucks were soaring 40, 50, even 60 feet in the air. Ramps were taller, engines were louder. The sport had become a spectacle, faster, brighter, more dangerous. And through it all, he watched. Sometimes from the track, sometimes from the pits, sometimes from the back of the arena where the air smelled like popcorn, exhaust fumes, and cold winter nights. He wasn't jealous. Not really. It was pride mixed with something heavier, something he didn't want to name. He had lived the moment when all of this was nothing more than a backyard experiment, a crazy idea, a man welding steel in a barn while ignoring the clock on the wall. He'd lived the moment when crushing a few junkyard Chevys felt like the most rebellious thing a man could do on a Saturday afternoon. But now people expected monster trucks to fly. They expected backflips, high jumps, multi-million-dollar engineering. Young drivers, kids who weren't even born when he built his first giant truck, were signing autographs like rock stars. Promoters didn't want to know about the history. They wanted to know how fast you could go and how spectacularly you could land. Sometimes, late at night, he'd sit beside his truck in the dim glow of a garage light. He'd run his hand along the metal, cold, familiar, scarred from decades of repairs. This machine wasn't just steel and bolts. It was memory, sweat, sacrifice. It was a piece of American machinery built during a time when men fixed things with their hands, not laptops. And he wondered quietly, is there still a place for me in the sport I helped create? One evening, after a big show, a reporter approached him, a young kid, barely out of journalism school, microphone trembling in his hand. "Sir," he asked, "how does it feel to watch these new trucks take the sport to the next level?" He paused, looked around at the roaring crowd, looked at the bright stadium lights, the pyrotechnics, the energy buzzing through the air. And he smiled, not out of sadness, but out of understanding. "It's supposed to be this way," he said softly. "You build something, and eventually it grows bigger than you." That quote ended up on a few fan blogs, maybe a magazine or two. But the people who mattered, the men and women who lived through the early days, felt something deeper in those words. They remembered a time when the sport was raw, untamed, when the trucks weren't polished showpieces, but rough, thunderous beasts built in barns and garages across America. And they knew he was right. Still, the decision gnawed at him. Should he rebuild, modernize, reinvent, or had his chapter already reached its end? One night, while closing up his shop, he glanced at an old photo taped to the wall, a faded Polaroid from the early days. Him, his original monster truck, 3 crushed cars beneath the tires. A crowd of maybe 50 people cheering around a dirt lot. He stared at it for a long time, and in that quiet moment, he finally understood what he had to do. He stood alone in the quiet of the workshop, long after the crowds had gone home, long after the echo of engines and cheering had faded into memory. The fluorescent lights hummed softly above him, flickering just enough to remind him of the years he'd spent beneath them, fixing, welding, dreaming, rebuilding. The old truck sat in the center of the shop like a monument, not to fame, not to success, but to a life's work. He walked around it slowly, running his fingers across the dents and scars the machine had collected over decades. Every gouge in the steel told a story. Every weld mark was a memory frozen in time. Every replaced bolt was a moment of frustration or triumph. Nobody, not the new drivers, not the newer teams, not even the fans, truly knew how many nights he'd spent right here, wrench in hand, working until sunrise because a show was scheduled the next afternoon and canceling wasn't an option. He paused at the driver's door, rested his hand on the handle, and let out a long breath. "Been a hell of a ride," he whispered. And he meant it. Because the truth was, he'd already accomplished everything he ever set out to do without even realizing it. He had built something no one had seen before, something American to its core, something loud, ridiculous, spectacular, and beautiful, something that brought families together, something that made kids dream, something that made grown men feel like kids again. He didn't need trophies or titles. That was never his purpose. The applause wasn't the reward. The fame wasn't the destination. The real payoff was knowing he'd sparked a movement, one that would continue long after he stepped away. He leaned against the truck and listened to the quiet. For the first time, the silence felt peaceful instead of heavy. He thought about the young drivers now dominating stadiums, the innovators building trucks with technology that didn't exist when he first welded axles in his barn, the engineers pushing limits he once thought were unreachable. And instead of fear, instead of jealousy, instead of regret, he felt pride. Because that's what pioneers do. They lead, they build, and then eventually they let go. A soft breeze slipped through the workshop door. Outside, the night was calm. No roaring engines, no bright lights, just the quiet hum of a world he helped shape. He grabbed his coat, flicked off the lights, and took one last look at the monster in the darkness. It didn't look intimidating anymore. It didn't look like a beast. It looked like a friend, a companion he'd built with his own two hands, a machine that had carried him into history. He stepped outside and closed the door gently behind him, not like someone leaving something behind, but like someone finishing a chapter on his own terms. As he walked to his truck, he knew the truth. The sport would keep evolving. New legends would rise. New machines would push boundaries he never imagined. And that was exactly how it should be. He smiled to himself, looked up at the night sky, and whispered the words only a true pioneer could say, with absolute peace in his heart. "I built the beginning. Now the future is theirs." Years later, people would still talk about him, not in stadiums, not in official interviews, but in quiet conversations at garage counters, in old diners with faded photos on the walls, and in the stands during intermissions when someone pointed to a new truck and said, "You know, none of this would have existed without that one guy." His name would come up the way legends always do, softly, with respect, followed by stories that sounded almost too good to be real. Stories about the first car crush, the long road trips, the nights spent welding in the dark, the roar of the crowd at the very first arena show, the moment a simple backyard machine ignited an entire motorsport. That's the thing about pioneers. They don't disappear. They echo. Every thunderous engine that shakes a stadium, every kid holding a die-cast monster truck, every family cheering from the bleachers, all of it carries a piece of his legacy. He never asked for credit. He never cared about fame. He never imagined his creation would outlive him. But it did, and it will. Because what he built wasn't just a truck. It was a spark that lit a fire so bright that generations would gather around it. Fathers and sons, grandfathers and grandkids coming together over pure American horsepower and the joy of seeing something bigger, louder, and bolder than anything they ever thought possible. And if you've enjoyed this journey, if his story made you remember the old days or feel something deep in your chest the way a real engine does, then stick around. There are more stories like this, more forgotten legends, more pioneers who shaped American motorsport and never got the recognition they deserved. So before you go, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and leave a comment with which legend you want us to uncover next. Because history is alive as long as we keep telling it.